Arc 5, Chapter 74, Fruits of the Battle for Pristella, Part 1.
The heinous witch cult who had captured the 4 control towers and threatened the city has been repelled. With this, the safety of the city is affirmed. The triumph is that of the Watergate City Pristella! Subaru heard the broadcast that resonated in the city, along with Emilia, as they hurried to the city hall. The cheerful announcement was transmitted through a magical device that conveyed the voice to the city. Although there were parts where the sound broke, those were the only fluctuation of voice of the person making the broadcast. There was no reason to doubt the contents of the welcoming announcement.
Subaru, just now they said...
So it seems. Somehow or other, it feels like it's over.
In front of the suddenly bright-faced Emilia, Subaru relaxed his cheeks as he dropped his shoulders. The reason for his listlessness was out of relief and a little bit of anxiety.
At any rate, it's because the enemies are who they are.
There was Capella of Lust, who possessed the authority of variation and change. In the worst-case scenario, there was the possibility of the broadcast voice being a ploy to cast false hope over the citizens. There was no guarantee they would not go that far, and that malice was what made the Sin Archbishop so frightening. However, the voice of the broadcast had introduced itself as Kiritaka Muse. Albeit the statement had been consciously respectful, faint emotions and joy both had not been concealed. Upon hearing that voice, one did not have any reason to worry about being fooled by such wicked trickery.
That means that everyone did it.
The broadcast had stated that the 4 control towers occupied by the Sin Archbishops had been recaptured. At least with this, it was safe to assume that the end in which all the floodgates would end up being opened and the city would end up being both flooded and annihilated had been avoided. On that point, they could be sincerely relieved. If there was one problem which fueled Subaru's concern, it would be the victims.
Miraculously, Regulus didn't end up causing any casualties.
Although they had a somewhat powerful lineup as well, their enemies were Sin Archbishops with 1 or 2 peculiarities to them. The only reason they had overcome the crusade against the invincible Regulus was because he himself was lousy in battle. There were the cunning Lust and Wrath, whose defeat he had not been able to witness, and Gluttony, with whom he was connected by fate. Calling them difficult enemies or threats was simply not enough. Even though they had won, the possible damage was frightful.
According to what Subaru said, there were also Sin Archbishops of the witch cult in the other control towers. All the others... I wonder if they're okay.
They were Emilia's words that were accompanied by the same unease Subaru felt, who could not put on a joyful face. Subaru shook his head, biting his lip, in front of Emilia, who had cast her gaze down.
I also feel troubled about that, but all we can do is trust in the others. I want to confirm that they are fine as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that's right.
He could not dispel Emilia's distress with such simple words of comfort. If they considered how powerful the enemies had been this time around, they could not avoid the possibility that there were victims among their allies. Still, it could not be said that the massive destruction to save the city was the result they had desired. Thus, although it depended on the circumstances, taking into account the using of return by death as one of his options was a determination which Subaru had held since the start of this operation. Personally, Subaru did not like the strategy of incorporating his return by death. Of course, he was opposed to choosing his own death, but it was also related to the trial he had witnessed at the Sanctuary, the world after Subaru's death. In fact, it was not known whether the world continued after Subaru's death or not, but the trials had revealed that such a possibility existed. So Subaru had firmly decided that he would not use return by death to increase the number of attempts. Even so, if Subaru were willing to choose return by death, it would be when the unacceptable result of having to continue with a loss awaited him. And at this time, Subaru was considering such a possibility. Those who had sworn to recapture the city and challenge the Sin Archbishops, the royal candidates, their knights, and their allies. In order not to lose those he did not want to lose, he was prepared to repeat the pain and suffering.
Subaru? Your brow is really wrinkled.
Eh?
Emilia was gazing straight ahead at Subaru, who had a grim and serious expression on his face. She had shot Subaru and his wrinkled brow a look, causing him to reflexively open his eyes up wide. As her amethyst eyes filled with gloom, Emilia spoke to him.
After all, no matter what you do, you still care. I'm sorry. Although it's a difficult time, thanks to those who captured me.
No, it's not Emilia Tan's fault. Even without Emilia Tan, it was necessary to defeat Regulus. If Emilia Tan hadn't been there, I don't know if we could have saved the brides.
To save the brides from greed, they had to temporarily stop their hearts, which carried the lion's heart. Emilia was probably the only one who could have done it from their existing lineup. Felix perhaps could have also been a possibility. Without them, in the worst case scenario, it would have been necessary for the brides to become sacrifices to defeat Regulus.
Well, I didn't want to make that choice either, and Reinhard wouldn't have allowed it.
Even if it were a necessary sacrifice to face such great evil, he could not accept that. That young man, who was a bundle of justice, could never allow even a few sacrifices. In that situation, the affair with Regulus might not have been resolved so quickly.
Or I may have ended up dying halfway through, in the case I'd been the only one that'd end up getting involved.
First of all, if Emilia had not been kidnapped, there was the chance that the formations of the teams to defeat the Sin Archbishops would have been very different. Since no one knew what the right answer was, it was useless to think about. But, hopefully.
After we split up, Reinhard went to the others. That will lessen the damage. That is what I want to believe.
Yes, that's true. We have to make sure of that as soon as possible.
In response to Subaru's reply, Emilia nodded with a serious look on her face. And, as he resumed his step towards the city hall next to her, Subaru gently placed his hand on his own chest. He felt that his heart was beating slightly faster. There, another concern that Subaru had apart from his preparations for return by death. The sensation of a strange black force callously curling in the immediate vicinity of his heart. It was a perverse impurity that had slipped into Subaru at the same time the death of Regulus was confirmed. Subaru vaguely knew the identity of that impurity. A witch factor. That was the true identity of the impurities that connected Subaru to the witches' cult. Just after defeating Pedalcus Romaniconti of Sloth, Subaru had felt the same discomfort inside his body. The identity of the foreign force he had felt was a witch factor, and the first person who told him that was the witch Echidna. The witch factors had a profound connection to the Sin Archbishops and the Witches of Sin, and for some reason, they also affected Subaru, as if it was consuming him. If so, this was surely related to the Witch of Envy who induced his return by death. It was not something that could be considered positive.
No matter how many creepy things possess me, I'm me. That should be fine.
No matter how much the influence of the witch factors increased, he would never let them affect him, even if a witch factor consumed Subaru every time he took down a Sin Archbishop. Plus,
If Behiko wakes up, she'll get mad at me for not having told her.
no matter what the witch factors were, there was no need for Subaru to worry about them alone. He had his companions who would work together with him to try and solve the problem if he confessed his concerns to them. He was sure he would find a way to get over it.
Subaru? Did something happen?
Worried about Subaru, who had spoken awkwardly, Emilia turned her glance to him. Subaru said no and shook his head, and after thinking a little,
By the way, while listening to that broadcast before, I think Kiritaka's doing alright. Liliana surely would be glad if she gets to know that.
Kiritaka-san disappeared.
He protected Otto, and it was unknown whether he was dead or alive. For some reason, it didn't feel like he was dead, so I wasn't that worried.
Then cheer up more, or I'm going to end up feeling sorry for you.
As if she were casting away the anxiety that hung over him, Emilia pouted at Subaru. Instead of being anxious about the possibility that someone had been hurt, he should have been glad that someone had been saved. Perhaps that was also a necessary attitude for his current state of mind. And so, the two of them rushed on, trying to avoid triggering each other's anxieties as much as possible. But the scene that awaited them was not something optimistic.
That is terrible.
Subaru was stunned to see that the city hall had collapsed and turned into the mountain of rubble in front of his eyes. The words that came from his dry lips gave off a candid impression of that scene. The city hall was a 5-story tall building, something rare to see in the buildings of this world, but its greatness had crumbled without a trace. The marks of destruction extended as far as the foundations of the building. The center of the plot of land where the city hall had been located had been crushed thoroughly, the large sunken hole looking like an open mouth. This collapse likely could not have happened unless the foundations of the buildings had received a major blow. Subaru made this assumption from the remains of the building. Emilia, who witnessed the same thing, gazed around with a restless expression on her face.
The broadcast from before. It should have used the magical device in that building, no? Yet, with the building in this state...
Now that you say that, that's right.
Faced with Emilia's concern, Subaru looked around his surroundings in a hurry. The collapse of the city hall was not an unimportant matter. It was undoubtedly the result of having been breached by the evil grasp of the witches' cult. In addition to that, in the city hall there was not only the magical device. Otto and the others who didn't participate in the groups to recover the control towers, and the victims of Capella's authority, also remained. Since the city hall had suffered so much damage, it meant that there had been a battle. If so, what had happened in the city hall, where only the non-combatants had stayed behind? Kiritaka's transmission, even the fact of that matter, had become suspicious. But Subaru's concerns...
Beatrice?
When he looked up, Beatrice was at the top of the rubble looking at the two of them, and she walked down holding the hem of her fluffy dress. She went down to Subaru's side, who opened his eyes in surprise, and looked at him from top to bottom to check the condition he was in.
You don't seem to be injured. I'm relieved, I suppose. If you'd been hurt while Betty was absent, I wouldn't have been able to leave you alone, even to go to the bathroom, in fact.
I'm not a kindergarten-age kid to need that much care. Or rather, what I should be saying is, Bayako, why are you here?
Subaru was surprised by Beatrice, who had crossed her short arms and held her head high with an aloof expression of composure on her face. That flippant attitude was exactly the same as always.
Weren't you supposed to have spent all your mana and left the front lines? At least, you should have been able to participate in this battle.
Spent sounds like you're blaming Betty for doing something wrong, so stop, I suppose. If it weren't for Betty's devotion, your leg would be a little thinner now, in fact. Your thanks, your appreciation, and your hugs aren't gonna be enough, I suppose.
I know.
Subaru gently stroked the furious Beatrice's head the way he always did. Beatrice puffed her cheeks in dissatisfaction, but even so, she took a step closer to Subaru, quietly enjoying his caresses. And, following the interaction between Contractor and Spirit, Emilia gently butted in.
Beatrice?
Thank goodness. Emilia seems to be fine too, in fact. If something had happened to you, Bubby would have been distraught, I suppose. Thanks to that, Subaru risked fighting without Betty, in fact. If you learned anything out of this, don't let yourself be captured again, I suppose.
Thank you. I'm sorry for making you worry.
In particular, Betty was only a little bit worried for you, in fact.
Emilia looked at Beatrice, who had moodily turned her face away, with a smile on her face. Then, Emilia gazed over Beatrice's entire body and gently narrowed her widened eyes. An ornate dress and carefully manicured curled hair, both were slightly stained with mud and blood. This was the proof that the spirit girl had not recently woken up from her peaceful dreams. Subaru's absence, and the collapse of the city hall, Beatrice waking up was certainly not unrelated to these unexpected events. Emilia directed her gaze, which was full of such thoughts, and Subaru tucked his chin in. And, whilst looking down at Beatrice, whom he was still stroking, he said,
Thank you. It seems like you were hard at work during my absence. I'm sorry about everything. I only ever cause you problems.
I'm pretty used to Subaru causing me problems, so you don't have to worry about that, I suppose. No, do worry a bit about it still, in fact. Worry about it and give me your thanks, I suppose.
Yeah. But even if you were hard at work, it was a bit over the top. Crushing the entire building is a bit too much.
Huh? Beatrice did this?
Emilia looked at Beatrice with bemusement, whilst she pointed at the mountain of rubble.
I wonder how much it'll take to repair a building like this. Subaru, do you know?
With Bayako's pocket money, I know it'll be a big project that will take a few decades.
What are you two saying with those serious faces, in fact? What Betty did is different, I suppose. Betty saw this building only after it became rubble, in fact.
I said I know! If you'd struck it, we'd be able to hear it from really far away. Such a cute girl.
Subaru cackled as Beatrice tried to defend herself from the false accusations. If they'd encountered Beatrice near the remains of City Hall, then...
At least, it seems like we won't have to worry about the witch cult trying to get up to no good around here. So, what happened to Otto and the others who were supposed to be in the City Hall?
Explaining that will be complicated, I suppose. But those who were in the City Hall are...
We were able to escape as well, so you don't need to worry.
A voice with a Kansai accent, or rather more accurately, a Kararagi accent, jutted in between Beatrice's reply. As they turned around in response to that, they saw a petite figure which was walking around the mountain of rubble. For a moment, they felt something peculiar about the person's appearance, as the color of their hair that she was adjusting with a hand comb was of a different color than the one they were used to.
Is that you, Anastasia-san?
What's up with the doubt in the way you're calling me? Must be this, right? It's 'cause my hair color's different right now.
Her soft light purple hair was now dyed dark green. With Anastasia in her kimono, their impression changed a bunch. She looked at Subaru and Beatrice, and then when she looked at Emilia, she gracefully nodded in satisfaction.
Seems like you were able to get Emilia-san back without any problems, Natsuki-kun. The Sword Saint told me, so I wasn't too worried about that.
So Reinhard was able to rendezvous with the others without any issues?
He came whooshing out of the sky. Right now, he's looking for any stragglers from the witch cult. Or rather, I should say that he's taken Ferris-san to visit the evacuation shelters.
Visiting the shelters. That sure is the duty of a healing arts user.
Even if they'd repelled the Sin Archbishops, considerable efforts would be needed to repair the damage the city had received. Fiatis' role would be quintessential for the quick recovery of the functions of the city. It looked like Reinhard was better used in place of Fiatis' own feet to get about.
I'm sorry. I also caused a lot of trouble. But what happened to you, Anastasia-san? Like, with the color of your hair? Or with this building?
Indeed! Did you have a makeover, changing your hair to a colour more pleasing to the eye? I think it suits you as well! But knowing the original Anastasia-san, it feels strange after all.
Natsuki-kun, you're pretty skilled at spewing out nonsense. However, I only dyed it for a little strategy. Besides, it didn't pay off. On the contrary, it went as bad as far as I could see.
Anastasia sighed as she twirled her hair around her finger and looked at the remains of the city hall. From the words she was saying, it seemed like she had been involved in the collapse of the city hall.
Ferris is fine, right? And what happened with the others?
The story's simple. After everyone left to defeat the Sin Archbishops, a bad guy attacked, taking advantage of your absence. They screwed things up a bit.
Doesn't look like they screwed things up only a little bit.
It was clear that it had been a ferocious battle, quite in contrast to Anastasia's lackadaisical tone. The attack on the city hall, a malignant trick that took advantage of the departure of the combatants. He felt like it was probably Lust or Wrath who had been behind this. However, the one he felt was most likely was
the one who came here Lust?
She was, as I'd heard. Her personality's the worst. My encounter with her gave me the willies.
Her opponent should not have been so frivolous, tantamount to only giving someone the willies, but Anastasia's attitude did not show any signs of fear or shock. It took real guts to have encountered a Sin Archbishop. He wanted to flatter her with an "as expected of you," but more pressing than that, Subaru had something gnawing on his mind.
I'm sorry. We left for the control towers, and after there was a surprise attack on the city hall, I should have taken more care.
Don't worry about it. We just did as we fancied while Natsuki-kun was missing. Moreover, it's embarrassing that we didn't get anything out of it.
According to Anastasia's words, it seemed that she had been expecting a surprise attack. That was what Subaru felt. She had probably dyed her hair green as a strategy for that. When he thought to the relation between dark green hair and the person Capella was likely interested in, he could vaguely understand the strategy they had devised.
Anastasia-san, you dressed as Cruson and dangled them the bait. Is that what you mean? If just you and Ferris managed to repel Lust, then that'd leave us in a fix.
It would have been cool if we did that, but we had someone else there. Priscilla-san's esteemed knight.
Ow!
On hearing the unexpected name come out of her mouth, Subaru widened his eyes in surprise. Al had been the one least interested in the battle to recapture the city, and to begin with, he was supposed to have gone with Priscilla and Liliana to defeat Wrath. If he had indeed stayed behind to defend the city hall, the Wrath capture team would be in a state which invited uncertainty and anxiety about their combat force in combination.
Just so you know, the team that faced Wrath came back safely.
Anastasia explained this to Subaru, seeing the doubt etched all over his face. Whilst giving a wry smile, she looked over in the direction of the control tower that Wrath had occupied, and said,
Priscilla-san came back unharmed. The songstress Liliana came back along with her prince, to everyone's surprise.
Her prince? Do you mean Kiritaka? Those two went to battle, and came back with a guy we didn't know whether he was dead or alive. What happened?
There were too many mysteries, like Priscilla coming back unharmed from the battle with Wrath, and Kiritaka and Liliana reuniting. He would have liked to hear more details about that story, but he had to put the general gist of things at a higher priority than that.
Can I believe in the broadcast from Kiritaka before? The recovery of the control towers was a success. What follows that is the status of everyone who fought. What happened to them?
The city hall had collapsed, but they had probably taken the magical device out from it, so it did not mean that they had to doubt the possibility that the broadcast was a trap. The other problem was that in the end, they had only considered the damage to things from the start. And to Subaru's question, Anastasia said,
You needn't worry, Natsuki-kun. You and y'all were the last to come back.
We were the last ones. And what about the others?
Don't worry.
Emilia and Beatrice anxiously watched along with Subaru, who was showing slight traces of impatience. In front of those three, Anastasia nodded her head while smiling and said,
Everyone came back safely. Not a single person was missing.
And that was her response.
Captain! You came back safe!
The nearest evacuation shelter had become the new rally point in place of the city hall that had collapsed. A blond boy came running out and called with a cheerful smile as he looked at Subaru and the others who had joined him. It was Garfiel.
Oh, Garfiel?
When he tried to raise his hand, he was surprised by the figure that came running. Though Garfiel's upper body was naked, his whole body was covered in blood. Nonetheless, his expression was somewhat radiant. It seemed that even though he had a rather difficult battle, he had fulfilled his duty. Just by seeing that, Subaru immediately changed his expression from surprise to a smile.
Hey, it's you who doesn't seem well. Your face looks terrible.
Don't want to hear that from ya, Captain. But that's something I can't say. But Captain, you're the one who showed his guts. You rescued Emilia-sama without any problems.
Of course.
When Subaru proffered out his fist, Garfiel bumped it with his own. That was enough to honor each other's good fight.
But I heard Lust showed up at the city hall. You? Where and with whom were you fighting?
Tis obvious. With Kurgan, the Eight Arms. Although, don't know to what extent he can be called that name.
What do you mean?
My amazing self was fighting only with a dead body. Surely he wasn't like that back when he was alive. That's why I don't feel like I won.
It was a secret technique to manipulate the bodies of the dead and use them as warriors. There was no doubt that this time, this secret technique had been used in the secret maneuvers of the witch cult. However, it seemed that the warrior's ability was in a deteriorated state compared to when they were alive. Perhaps warriors like Garfiel were able to perceive the difference. As to whether that was bothering him, as apart from the victory itself, it somewhat seemed like Garfiel felt as if he had failed to obtain the desired result. That feeling, it was not something Subaru didn't know about.
The enemy wasn't strong? Is that why you're down?
Emilia, who had been listening into the conversation, tilted her head as she did not understand the feeling. At her words, Garfield first gave a, "Good thing you're safe," glad that she was back. Then he violently scratched his short blonde hair.
To be down 'cause he wasn't strong? That ain't it. Somehow, I can't explain it. 'Cause Emilia-sama's a woman.
It's something women don't understand. So, Subaru understands?
Just a little, though. But even for men, there's something like an unknown barrier between the strong and the weak. But I think the result is that Garfiel's strong. Aren't you overthinking this?
Am I, overthinking it?
Emilia had a face that showed her lack of understanding, and Subaru's response was not entirely positive. At that, Garfield nodded with a sorrowful look on his face. Garfield already had his head full of worries in respect to strength. There was the question of having challenged Reinhard to a duel, and also that he had received a painful initiation from the way of the witch cult afterwards. Even if he mulled it over, no matter how much he thought, the answer to his problem would not come into view. It was possible it was something like that. That was why, in regard to that...
Hey, Garfiel, if you think about it.
Oh, there's Garf! It's,
In front of Subaru, who was trying to give him some advice, Garfield's body fell down with a loud thump. He barely noticed the little figure colliding against Garfield's waist, but his hand did not come out in time to stop him from letting out a groan of pain and tumbling down. He gazed at the collapsed Garfield. The one who sat on his unguarded chest was a feline girl wagging her tail. The girl pricked up her ears as she put a cheerful and adorable expression on her face.
You let your guard down, Garf! Your real enemy is in your heart. And within your heart, you already have important people in there. I mean, it's filled!
You're not gonna climb on a person's chest.
The lady told Mimi that slapping a man on the butt can attract love, or something like that. The lady said that it's attractive or something. Slapping it on the butt is what the lady said.
Mimi squealed with laughter on top of Garfield. She was no longer in a state where she was losing blood from a deep wound that could not be healed. Before the face of the girl who had completely recovered, Subaru touched his chest and bent down.
You look lively, Mimi.
Oh,
Oni-san, welcome! Welcome. It seems like a lot of complicated things happened while Mimi was sleeping. Good job! Mimi slept very soundly, but it seems that Garf also tried very hard. Didn't he? Good job!
You don't seem to have changed. That's the most important thing. Isn't that right, Garfiel?
Subaru had heard that Mimi's wounds had been sustained from protecting Garfiel. Garfiel had been shook to the core by the wound that refused to heal, and he had carried her back on the verge of death. He wondered whether he was relieved to see Mimi better or not. But, at Subaru's call, Garfiel, who was still sitting on his butt, rubbed his nose.
Ha! It would have been problematic if she changed too much. I've said it many times, but making a fuss while you're recovering.
What? Did you see something, Garf? Ugh!
Mimi, who had brought her face close to Garfiel's, raised her voice and glanced down at her own chest. Mimi checked the inside of her white robe, and, opening her eyes wide with surprise,
Garf, this is terrible! The wounds reopened, blood streaming out!
Idiot! That's what I told ya! Again and again! Damn it! If I don't bandage it again and apply healing magic, it won't heal! Hey, come here!
Yeah! It hurts! It hurts!
Due to the wound getting worse, Garfiel took Mimi's hands, who remained composed, and took her to the inner part of the shelter. Faced with this exchange as noisy as a typhoon, even Subaru remained speechless.
But if Garfield stays like this, he may not have time to worry.
But next to Subaru, who remained stunned, Emilia placed her hand on her lips and said that suddenly. Whilst gazing at the back of the pair walking away, she referenced back to Garfield's prior worries.
I see.
Thought Subaru, in agreement with those opinions?
Despite everything, they make a good pair. Those two, that is.
Mimi is cute. And it seems like she really likes Garfield. It seems that Garfield likes Ram, so I don't think it's going to be that easy.
Yeah, for sure. Wait! Did Emilia turn and make a comment about love between men and women?
Even though the example was easy enough to understand, Subaru was surprised that she could make that kind of conversation. Emilia, who had even before Subaru's confession had been in a state where she did not understand the love between men and women, had been able to comment on the love of others.
Subaru, I feel like you just said something really rude.
Alright. Though, I'd thought it was an accurate recognition. No way! Did Emilia change without me noticing? And she's dressed in a wedding dress!
Even though it's ended up very much in tatters.
Due to the fact that it was difficult to move around in, she had torn her wedding dress. It seemed like she did not need to worry much about that around here.
My, in fact. They're all a bunch of children. It seems like they only grew up in size, I suppose.
I don't want to hear that from you, who most resembles a child here.
When Beatrice threw out her jape to cap things off, Subaru cleared his throat. Then, thinking if Mimi had recovered, that meant that he looked around the shelter in search of an answer. In a corner where there were people rejoicing at their reunion, he found the figure of the elder swordsman standing in silence. Subaru held his breath for a moment at the figure of the sword demon, who had his eyes closed in silence.
Huh? Subaru?
Sorry. I'll be right back.
Replying back to the anxious-looking Emilia, Subaru left both her and Beatrice there, and slowly walked up to where he had pointed his gaze to. First of all, what should he call out to him? However, that worry ended up being unnecessary.
Is it Subaru? Dono?
Yeah, it is.
Wilhelm, who had opened one of his eyes, caught sight of Subaru, who had approached him, hesitating on speaking out first. Seeing those silent blue eyes, Subaru realized that keeping his silence was pointless. Wilhelm was resting his back against a cold stone wall, blending into the landscape. Subaru stood beside him and saw his figure from the corner of his eyes. A figure full of wounds that made him feel the echoes of a violent battle. There were traces of cuts all over his light garb without his jacket. The gray hair that he kept tied back had come loose and was flowing down to his back. What looked more painful was the blood-stained cloth that was wrapped around the top of his right leg. That was enough to know that it was a deep wound that threatened his life. But what caught Subaru's attention the most was not Wilhelm himself. It was the jacket that was right next to him, which had something that seemed important wrapped inside it.
Wilhelm-san, that is...
He had tried to check what was wrapped up in his jacket without giving it any thought. Receiving Subaru's words, Wilhelm directed his gaze to the bundle. The wizened swordsman kept his silence for a moment, and then moved his parched lips.
It is, as you have guessed. It is My wife. Immediately after losing her life, her body turned into a pile of ashes. It would have been too wretched to leave her body exposed to the wind this way, even though it is shameful that I had to put her in my jacket. Even if she had been reduced to mere ashes, I wanted to put her in a grave and mourn her.
It meant that the secret technique that moved the corpses of the dead, the corpses turned into ashes upon their demise. It was a sacrilege towards one's soul after death, and the impact it had on the people who had ended up being the target of this secret technique was immeasurable. He could not even imagine what was going on in Wilhelm's heart if he gave it some thought.
I'm really sorry. It is a rather unmanly, meaningless attachment.
Don't say such a thing!
Subaru immediately raised his voice on hearing Wilhelm's self-depreciating tone. Whilst unaware that he had gotten himself worked up, Subaru looked straight ahead at Wilhelm. Wilhelm cracked open his eyes and looked over at Subaru as well.
I don't think you're wrong, Wilhelm, son. Not now, nor back during the White Whale. You're an incredible person who I respect. What's so wrong about appreciating the people you care about? There's nothing to be ashamed of. Thinking like that is no good.
Subaru, Dono.
You're incredible, Wilhelm, son. Your wife? Placing her in her grave? Mourning her? Those thoughts are no mistakes. I can't really express myself well, but you're amazing!
Those were his true feelings. Those were, without a doubt, Subaru's true feelings, his true thoughts that he did not wish to be denied. Back at the time of the White Whale, and now, during his sorrowful reunion, destiny had been really cruel to Wilhelm. Yet even so, the sword demon had gone against destiny to his utmost. He had traversed it with his own willpower and tried to reach love. Not all results may end up being rewarded. His repentance and remorse might remain sempiternally, but that should be correct. Wilhelm's love in loving the one he loved, it all should end well.
It's nothing to be ashamed of. Please, duly place her in her grave. And, if the opportunity presents itself, and it's not too much of a nuisance, please, let me visit her grave as well. I want to do so. I think that's what a person ought to do.
He was not wording himself well, and furthermore, he was getting emotional. Subaru grew vexed at himself. In pushing his own egotistical feelings, he would not be able to help it if Wilhelm burst into laughter. It would be quite natural for him to say that it was none of his business and refuse him. However, Wilhelm abruptly let his lips slacken before Subaru. A small gap broke through his stiffened, tense face, and he said,
Yeah, please do, Subaru Dono. I also want you to dedicate some words to my wife. I think if it's you.
Yes, I will. I'm honored.
He had gotten his permission, or more accurately, it was thanks to Wilhelm's generosity. After hearing Subaru's egotistical wish, Wilhelm let out a soft sigh. Guessing by his face that he did not want to talk anymore, Subaru bowed his head down. He should leave Wilhelm alone with his wife for a bit. But before leaving this place, he wanted to make sure of one last thing, and that was...
Wilhelm-san, about your wife, did you manage to?
Had he reached closure with her? Had he ended up reaching a result he had not sought? Naturally, confronting his dead wife could not have been the result he wished to acquire. Even so, no one other than Wilhelm could have been permitted to face her. After having taken that situation, Wilhelm had sought closure. Thus, Subaru should not have been the only one who wanted that at least.
My wife.
Wilhelm started to speak to Subaru, who had stopped in his tracks to look at him. But his words stopped there. Wilhelm's gaze moved slightly away from Subaru. He directed his gaze to his jacket that he had his wife's ashes wrapped up within. For a split second, a huge swirl of emotions floated through his irises. And he spoke out.
Yes, I exchanged words with my wife. And certainly, I said goodbye.
Words. It was a figurative expression most likely. Wilhelm's wife had been the prior sword saint. Clashing swords with her was a conversation like no other for the sword demon. Their blades of closure themselves should have been their final words of goodbye. That was why, surely that closure had been the result of Wilhelm's choice.
I love my wife. I should have gotten that across.
I see.
Wilhelm's quiet confession of love. In contrast to the modest tone in his voice, there was a zeal which scorched the hearts of those who listened to it, and Subaru's chest grew hotter. Taking a deep breath, Subaru closed his eyes. Pouring out of him were raging billows of emotions. Keeping each one in check, he opened his eyes back up. Wilhelm, who was in front of him, had a lonely smile on his face. However, since he had allowed himself to break into that smile, it felt as if it had been saved. And Subaru, too, allowed his lips to relax.
Wilhelm-san, thank you for your hard work. Perhaps everything will get hectic very soon, I think. But until then, please, rest. I'll go around a little more to see what happened.
Subaru spoke too quickly and was not sure whether the last words were appropriate or not. He scratched his cheek with one of his fingers and felt embarrassed as he turned his back on Wilhelm. Behind his back,
Subaru, Dono.
Yeah?
As he was called while he tried to leave, Subaru stopped and turned around. Then Wilhelm, who had a slight trace of surprise on his face, immediately said,
No.
With a shake of his head.
My apologies. It is something trivial. Please, do not fret about it.
Is that so? No, when you say it like that, it makes me feel the opposite. But, well, right, yes. I'll see you later.
Subaru walked away from there, with a bitter smile adorning his face due to Wilhelm's atypical reaction. Seeing what Subaru looked like when he returned, Emilia and Beatrice seemed to express relief on their faces. In that regard, Subaru's expression had probably changed quite a bit between the time he'd left and the time he'd come back. Subaru himself was well aware of that, since reuniting with the dead was not something to be happy about. But at least, Wilhelm had ended it with his own hands, and he was satisfied with the result. He felt that that fact was a modest salvation. As he narrowed his eyes, the sword demon stared at the back of the dark-haired boy who had walked away. His lips were firmly pursed together so as to hold something back. It was a breakdown in his camouflage, which until a little while ago had masked his real intentions with firm willpower. A frenzy of emotion which was likely to gnaw through his pursed lips if he were to disregard it, even now. Surely, what he kept hidden from the boy in his chest until then was...
Subaru, Dono. You are...
Only within his mouth, whispering in a hoarse voice, did the sword demon say the boy's name.
You could be my...
Having said that, the sword demon closed his eyes as if his own feeble heart were closed off. The continuation that made no sound was never heard by anyone. It was also something that would never come out of the mouth of the sword demon. That was the only thing which the sword demon would never allow.